The Triangle of Terror, written by William F. Temple, narrated by Edward E. French. Part 1. I had written nearly 3,000 words that day, and in the afterglow of self-satisfaction I decided that there was certainly something in this life of rural seclusion after all. In Bloomsbury, far too many people were acquainted with me and my address. They were just dropping in on me at all hours of the night and day with complete disregard for my work and their assumption a writer was a person who never worked anyway. His stories were things he just dashed off in odd moments now and again, with no particular thought, as one dashes off letters. After a string of nights on short rations of sleep trying to recover some of the time thus stolen from me during the day, I dashed off myself, away from London and these vampires of my attention, my friends. I took care that none of them, none but Spencer, that is, should know my address until I was good and ready for them. Then that meant when I had finished my novel, it was safe to tell Spencer. He never saw any of my other friends. They avoided him because he was odd, eccentric. In his musty bed sitting room in Mecklenburg Square, he lived in a world of his own. You sensed the strangeness as soon as you stepped into the room, and it was certainly enhanced by his presence. He was fattish. Why, I don't know, for I never saw him eat anything, and I believe older than he looked. He looked in his early 60s. Trying to maintain a conversation with him was indeed trying. You felt that quite 2/3 of his attention was somewhere else all the time, and he only intermittently remembered that you were there. And most of what he said to you he deliberately made cryptic. He had a torturous mind that loved to puzzle and mystify. Many times I had remonstrated with him. For God's sake, Spencer, speak straightforwardly and sensibly, will you? I can make more sense out of my income tax correspondence than I can out of you. When you did make sense out of him, it was invariably worth the trouble. He had more odd knowledge tucked away inside his head than Ripley ever dreamed upon, and he was full of surprising little tidbits that made me exclaim, "That gives me an idea for a story." I made quite a lot of money out of Spencer in this way. Maybe that was why I looked upon him as my best friend. In fact, the main reason that I elected to keep in touch with him from my lonely cottage among the gorse and pines of Surrey was because my novel dealt with medieval witchcraft, and I anticipated difficulty over 1 or 2 chapters. I might need to dig in Spencer's fund of knowledge about such things. Also, he had the best library of books on the occult that I had ever come across. It was through a previous search for out-of-the-way information that I originally encountered him. But about that evening when I was wandering alone across the Surrey heath, so comfortably satisfied with the day's work, it was an evening in midsummer, when the atmosphere was close and still, and the going of the sun had seemed to leave it more warm and oppressive than noonday. The air was a thick, almost liquid substance from which your lungs were hard-pressed to draw oxygen, almost as thick as the blood which pumped at your temples and made your head throb heavily. Headachy weather, and you longed for a storm to come and break it up. Somewhere this night there was a storm, for along the horizon the sheet lightning flickered and jumped and revealed silently weird-lit glimpses of an unsuspected cloudland that lay out there in the darkness. I don't know whether it is peculiar to me, but these strange, tense evenings of summer always set my imagination working more actively than the chilly autumn and winter nights beloved of the gothically romantic poets. Keats would begin, "In a drear-nighted December," and Poe's Ullalum would be carried to her tomb in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir on a night in the lonesome October. And as for the same gentleman's raven, who quoth, "Nevermore," distinctly I remember it was the bleak December. No, the winter was merely physically uncomfortable. A hot, thundery night like this made me mentally uncomfortable. Uneasily I sensed the imminence of something, I felt the electric charge slowly but unrelentingly building itself up in the air about me, forming something unknown but black and inimical, growing both in power and in consciousness of its power, awaiting with evil excitement the hour of its unleashing. Damn it, I thought, I've been thinking too much upon these things. This was the last novel I would write about the occult. The trouble with such an occupation was that the story becomes real to you as you write it, and you're disposed to picture warlocks and werewolves as things you might find in a dark corner of the coal cellar at some unlucky moment, especially when you've deliberately retired to solitude to get into your book. The glow of my self-esteem had now died somewhere among these unhealthy thoughts. I had walked too far and become overtired. The haven of my cottage seemed suddenly desirable, and I forced my heavy feet to quicken their lagging pace. Here now was the pinewood, like a blot of India ink on the lesser darkness of the night. 100 yards within it lay the cottage, but despite my impatience, they were the slowest 100 yards I traversed that night. Kieran himself would have tripped over something in the pitch blackness of the wood. Nothing of the distant flickering of the lightning penetrated here. I had literally to feel my way along the path. Then all of a sudden I stopped in surprise, my hand on the bole of a pine. Somewhere ahead of me glimmered a faint patch of light. Green light. As I watched it, it moved back and forth with a sort of dreadful, deliberate slowness. Then it stood still, and as I peered at it, I discovered a black cross, as it were, intersecting it. Abruptly the light disappeared and left me with the realization that the black cross had been the silhouette of the center of the cottage window's frame. Somebody, or something, was in the cottage. My heart started going like a two-stroke engine. Then the human habit of rationalizing unaccountable things came to the fore. It had been a firefly or a jack-o'-lantern of marsh gas from the stagnant pond not far beyond the cottage. Or again, this was the sort of weather that generated those globes of ball lightning which sometimes pop down chimneys and float around inside rooms. Or maybe a tramp was searching either for a bed for the night or for the money for one. But with a green light? I waited a while, but there was no return of the phenomenon. I hoped that whatever it was, it had gone away. Then I fumbled my way through the last few yards to the door and let myself in. In the darkness within I lit a match and by its feeble light surveyed the room. The words, "Is anybody there?" died in my mouth, for it was manifest that there was nobody. I conveyed the flame to the oil lamp, and the room became bright and cheerful. The shelves of books, still in their original colored dust jackets, gladdened my eye, as the sight of them always did, and the mottled galleon, the vase of marigolds, the shining pewter tankards were all familiar and reassuring things. Nevertheless, I poured myself a scotch and soda before I settled in the armchair by the tireless hearth to read over and polish the thousands of words I had scribbled that day. In the midst of my immersion in my own story of the burning of a particularly malignant witch, I suddenly noticed that the scalp muscles at the back of my head were taut and contracted, and that my hair must be bristling. And I felt in my mind what my body must have been aware of for some time, that there was some creature behind me and watching me with no friendly regard. Without seeming to divert my attention from my manuscript, I gazed up from under my brows at the mirror hanging above the fireplace. It showed the wall behind me empty, save for a framed watercolor of the devil's punch bowl at Hindhead, which was just as it should be. With a relaxing of tenseness, I returned to my work, but only for a few moments. Some words I had written earlier in the story recurred to me. Vampires cast no reflection in mirrors. A little cold tremor passed over me, then a spasm of fear-inspired anger at my childish timidity. Good Lord, to give a moment's credence to that Dracula claptrap! I swung round and positively glared behind me. There were no fearful fiends treading close behind me. There was nothing that had not been there before. Fool! I addressed myself bitterly, and began to turn slowly back, en route, as it were. My eye flickered past a brass warming pan hanging on the side wall, and then abruptly flicked back to it, for I had the impression of a dim and shapeless sort of face staring from its bright round surface. I sat and regarded it. Yes, there was certainly the effect of a face, an immobile, dead sort of face like that of the man in the moon, and scarcely better defined. I got up to examine it, and it faded as I approached it, and quite disappeared when I got my nose within a yard of it, leaving just the empty surface of the pan. Yet when I sat back again in my chair, there it was once more. 2 round black holes of eyes, a beaky nose, a twisted gash of a mouth. Along the top of the sideboard on the opposite side of the room to it was an assemblage of objects of ornament and utility. Prominent among them were 2 ebony candlesticks, top-heavy things with round, bulbous sockets for the candles. It was plain to me that the eyes of the face were simply the reflection of these 2 black balls, the nose a partial and distorted reflection of a vase, and the mouth probably a dent in the pan which caught and held a content of shadow at this particular angle. I dismissed the matter and returned again to my scribbled pages. In a little while I came to a passage that I judged needed wholly rewriting, and I stared thoughtfully before me while I endeavored to cast it afresh in my mind. Subconsciously at first, and then with a start of realization, I became cognizant that I was gazing straight at another face. It was in the carving of one of the pillars of the fireplace. From the coils of raised stone ostensibly representing climbing vines, a demonic little visage regarded me with sharp, slanting, spiteful eyes, vulpine face like that of a fox cornered and snarling. So alive and venomous did it seem that I instinctively moved back a little with confused ideas of defensive measures. That slight movement was enough to make the illusion vanish, for it was an illusion, another trick of light. Yet though I experimented by changing my attitude in my chair, I could not get the effect to repeat itself. Indeed, I even became uncertain of the spot amid the intricacies of the carvings where it had seemed to appear. Not very surely I returned to my business, but it was a long while before I could put those 2 faces from my mind. I had almost finished when that sickening feeling of being watched came over me again. For a little while I dared not raise my eyes from the papers that trembled in my hands. In my imagination it seemed to me that I was surrounded by a host of evil and silently threatening faces, that they leered and glowered not only from the dark corners, but also from the bright surfaces of things I had thought so homely and reassuring when I had come in from the outer darkness. With a sudden resolution to face them all and be damned to them, I looked up. I caught a fleeting impression of a huge face filling the whole wall of the empty alcove beside the fireplace, but the patches of discoloration from dampness that had apparently formed it seemed almost to shift apart in that instant and become wholly innocent and of no significance. I threw my papers down and jumped up with an oath. "What is this?" I demanded of myself. "Am I going mad, or is something trying to drive me mad?" I went determinedly round the room, gazing straightly at all of its contents in turn, but I saw nothing in the least out of the ordinary. Then I stood in the middle of the hearth-rug and debated upon my state of affairs. Firstly, I had no further inclination to do any more work on my book tonight. I had had enough of pondering upon the sinister. Secondly, I wished either that I had company, or was in some less lonely spot in the countryside than I was. But outside the cottage was the wood, and outside the wood stretched the wide heath under the night sky. Miles of black mystery between me and the nearest glow of humanity. Thirdly, despite my day's unusual mental and physical effort, I no longer felt tired, nor did the thought of bed lure me. I felt that if I did sleep now, bad dreams, if nothing worse, would come. I decided that I would write some letters, just to hold, as I wrote them, the mental image of some of those exuberant friends of mine in London from whom I had fled, would provide something of a sense of company. It would give me a link with that pleasant world of every day from which I was so utterly cut off on this stifling, electrically ominous night. The thought of letters caused me to wonder whether any had been delivered in the evening post while I had been out. I was already opening the little door of the letter cage when it occurred to me that I had deliberately withheld my address from all but Spencer. Nevertheless, I groped irrationally in the dark interior, and felt a little thrill of pleasure when my fingers encountered a letter, the only one. I felt something else, too, a mild shock which made those fingers tingle a bit. It was almost as if the letter had contained an electrical charge. I put it down to the atmosphere. The letter was from Spencer, as I might have guessed. It wasn't very helpful, looked at from any point of view. He was in his most cryptic mood. It was in neat typescript and began without any preamble. It was signed, "Yours faithfully," by Spencer, and that seemed to me almost the only comprehensible part of it. As for the rest of it, well, here it is, word for word, as I remember it. Acle, capital A-C-L-E, Acle. The composer, Robert Schumann, long heard voices and saw things that were not there. He went mad. Angle, capital A-N-G-L-E, Angle, as did, in like manner, the author of Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. Agram, capital A-G-R-A-M, Agram. The poet Shelley was tormented all his life with dreams and visions. Once, in a waking vision, he encountered a figure shrouded in a dark cloak. It was himself. On another occasion, he heard a noise outside the country cottage where he was staying. He opened the door and was struck unconscious by something invisible. Ageron, capital A-G-E-R-O-N, Ageron. When young, John Bunyan had fearful dreams and visions. Pestilent spirits and devils appeared to him until he reached the age of 17. Then they disappeared for 2 years, during which time he gave himself up to every evil passion and led a corrupt life. In 1651 his visions came again, and he said that he was hounded by the devil. He swore that he sometimes felt the tempter pull my clothes, and sometimes the devil took the form of a bull, bush, or besom. All the demons in the Pilgrim's Progress came out of his memories of these experiences. Alpha, capital A-L-P-H-A, Alpha. William Blake, the poet and artist, had dreams and visions all his life. He left a record of not only how he saw the devil, but also how he drew him. He wrote, "I was going downstairs in the dark when suddenly a light came streaming at my feet. I turned around, and there he was, looking fiercely at me through the iron grating of my staircase window. As he appeared, so I drew him." Blake's sketch showed a horrible phantom glaring through a grated window, with burning eyes, long teeth, and claws like talons. William Blake went mad. So, my friend, remember while you are pent up in your little cottage to beware of dreams and visions. No, decidedly not a cheering communication. I cursed the man for his perverted sense of humor, if this was supposed to be humor, and his maddening obscurantism. But it struck me as strange that the arrival of such an effort as this should coincide with the time at which I was seeing things. I sat down and studied the typed sheet with a frown. Acle, Agram, Ageron. What gibberish words were these? What connection was there between them? If I guessed Spencer's twisted mind right, there was some link. Quite possibly he had put a clue in the wording. He was always searching for some such crazy but deliberate clues in the writings of Shakespeare to indicate that the plays were actually written by Francis Bacon. I went slowly through the wordage again. Why, I pondered, a capital P for pent Wait a moment. Pentacle Pentagram? I seized upon a volume of my encyclopedia and sought what I soon found. This entry: Pentacle, Pentangle, Pentagram, Pentageron, or Pentalpha. These various names all belong to the design of a five-pointed star, composed of 5 straight lines, which may be formed complete without severance of the tracing medium from the recording medium. That is, it may be drawn without the pen being lifted from the paper, for the tip of the pen returns to its starting point. Possibly for some such oddity as this, the sign has long been used as a mystic symbol, first by the Pythagoreans and later by the astrologers and necromancers of the Middle Ages. It is found frequently in early ornamental art, and is still sometimes used in superstitious regions of the world on doorways to keep away witches and evil spirits. There followed representations of the pentacle, etc., and the hexagram, 2 interlaced equilateral triangles with which it is often confused. While I had the P volume in my hand, I thought I might as well look up Pythagoras, of whom I knew nothing except that he had been a Greek philosopher with a theorem. His time, it appeared, was the 6th century B.C., and he traveled around quite a lot, passing through Egypt among other places, and went to Italy in 529 B.C. and founded there a religious brotherhood for the reformation of mankind through practicing certain rites. Reaction against him began in his lifetime and reached a head in the middle of the 5th century B.C. This movement was violently trampled out. Meeting houses of Pythagoreans were everywhere sacked and burned, and Pythagoreans persecuted and slain. Well, all that was fairly interesting, I suppose, but I still didn't see any point to the letter. Yet there was still the coincidence of its arrival in my fit of the willies. I lay back in my chair with half-closed eyes, pondering on the dreams and visions of the illustrious people Spencer had listed. I was a writer of sorts, an artist in my own particular line. I prided myself, but I had no illusions about my name living any longer than I did. 100 years hence, no one would be the slightest bit interested to learn that I had died in a madhouse or had regular bouts of delirium tremens. For some time my mind dwelt upon the ephemerality of the second-rate writer's little fame, and then began to work in its usual way of putting 2 ideas together and fashioning from them something fresh. The slow shaping of a new story about a brilliant writer who went mad at the height of his fame went on in my imagination. I was lost in it. Detachedly I became aware that the illumination of the room appeared to be slowly changing in its quality. The normal yellowy-white light of the oil lamp was taking on a faint tinge of green. I was still deep in abstraction and paid little heed to it at first, but presently it became so pronounced that I took an absent-minded look at the lamp. It was very low. I remembered in a vague sort of way that I had forgotten to get any more paraffin. The greenish light was coming from somewhere on my left, where the window was, and I thought it was some queer effect of the moonlight shining in. I glanced over at the window, and my heart gave a bound that I thought had displaced it. A sort of silent, screaming horror held me paralyzed. The window was a square of greenly translucent light, as though it were the side of an artificially illuminated aquarium, and glaring through it at me was William Blake's nightmare vision of the devil. The eyes burned into mine. The fangs were revealed in a tiger's grin. The whole effect was that of a monster aflame with sadistic appetite, measuring its distance for a pounce at my throat. There's a copyright on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Inquiries should be made to email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. That's edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. And don't forget, every week we post on the Fiction Fantastique channel. Click on www.youtube.com
/ French Edward 06.